Hi guys, welcome to the episode 7 of the Highman podcast. It is Thursday the 6th of October, 4:05 p.m. Welcome. How are we doing, Pete?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. I'm looking forward to this episode. So today's episode is going to be about the movie Fight Club.
Yes.
In previous episodes, we spoke a lot about Nietzsche, and I think there's certain ideas in this which link quite heavily to that. And yeah, I think there's a lot going on that we can talk about. It's quite relevant to people in the modern world, particularly men in the modern world. So yeah, it should be a good one.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've not watched it properly in a long time, but obviously you can't really forget the gist of the movie because it's so just fucking sick, really.
Yeah, it's cracking little movie. But basically, the way we'll go through it is we'll sort of go through the movie chronologically, looking at some of the key stages, I think, and the key talking points in each of those stages. So we'll kind of just get straight into it. So we'll start with the start of the movie and talk about kind of the character of the narrator at the start of the movie, what he's like, what his life is like, and sort of a starting point for the transformation that takes place within the movie.
Yeah.
So basically, we look at this person's life, and amongst a lot of things going on, I think it's the narrator lives a very sort of meaningless existence. So if you take a look at his life, he works a sort of typical office job. I think it's for like some car insurance company, a car sales company, where he just like makes copies of things. And basically, it's not very meaningful work to him. I guess the work is just sort of a means towards an end, and he's just sort of the cog in the larger machine,
Yeah.
without any sort of individual value. And this is kind of reflected. He's not really given a name in the movie. Obviously, his
Known as the narrator.
yeah, he's known as the narrator, which sort of reflects his interchangeability and how, as an individual, he doesn't have much of an individual identity. And speaking of which, with the individual identity, he tries to get that through consumerism. There's a scene where he's talking about his IKEA furniture, and he's looking for a magazine, thinking, what sort of furniture will define me as a person? Because he doesn't
Yeah.
really have any true individualism. And I think the movie is largely a criticism of materialism and how it tricks you into thinking that this is where you get your individualism from. So it's a big criticism of that. So yeah, any thoughts on that so far, Kaylock?
Um, yeah, I mean, it is interesting, like how you said, as the narrator, not actually be given an identity. It makes him interchangeable, but it kind of makes him almost like nothing. Like you could say it makes him interchangeable and like adaptable to become a different character, depending on how he feels each day. But like someone's identity is kind of entrenched in like how long they've had it almost.
Mm-hmm.
So like him being called the narrator means he's kind of got no identity at all, which is interesting because then obviously later on in the movie we meet Tyler, which we'll talk about further into this podcast. And you could argue that's his identity, that he's kind of always had a connection to. But yeah, I'd say at the start he's definitely just meaningless, and like you said, a big cog in the machine, which
Yeah.
he can contribute to a lot of people that live today.
Yeah, but like with the interchangeability, it's sort of like anyone could do what the things that he does. Anyone could do his job. He doesn't
Right.
really have any friends or family or much else going on. He's just sort of this cog in the machine. So to put it in the consumption of stuff from large corporations, and also just sort of cog machine. The company he works at, there's a line from it like everything is just a copy of a copy, which is just very meaningless work. But so in the previous episodes, we spoke a lot about Nietzsche's idea of the last man, and I think the narrator is basically the epitome of The Last Man. So he deals with the meaninglessness in his life by consumption. So there's a scene in it where he's just sitting on, like, he spends his free time just sitting on the sofa mindlessly consuming content from the TV. So yeah, that really reflects the sort of last man, which is Nietzsche's idea of someone who, with lack of meaning in their lives, tries to overcome that or dampen the lack of meaning simply through consumption and comfort and pleasure. But ultimately, it's very nihilistic and meaningless existence.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how like I think it was last episode we talked about like trying to be a higher man, or like the Ubermensch, and you were talking about like the act of kind of working towards a goal, even though you might never attain that goal in the end. Just the act of doing that like gives someone's life so much meaning. And you could almost flip that and say it's similar to consumerism. Like you can consume as much as you want, but you always want to consume more, and you'll never really meet that end goal of being happy. So it's interesting how those two kind of ideas are parallel, even though they're kind of complete opposite at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. You'll never reach that goal, but it's about, I guess, who you become in the process. It's more important than the goal itself. And consumption, and yeah, they're the opposite in terms of consumption being, I mean, why is consumption? You're taking in things, whereas sort of improvement and aiming towards goals is sort of you're looking to create something, you're looking to grow and improve and expand, rather than just consuming from the outside. You're projecting your own value onto the world.
Yeah. Do you say that someone would, like, in the act of going after that goal of creating value, that someone becomes more important than the end goal almost? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Or would you think that?
I think, yeah, I guess the point I was making was perhaps to some degree the goal that you choose is arbitrary, but the fact that you've chosen a goal and you're building towards something that brings your potential out of you and allows you to manifest your potential, which you never would have been able to do otherwise, had you have just been consuming. But obviously there are, like, to say character development that is all that matters when it comes to achieving goals isn't really true, because like with Nietzsche's idea of the last man and the higher man, he talks about the higher man being someone who has a unifying life goal which is beyond their own life, so they look to achieve things which will have a lasting impact beyond their own lives. So that would be regardless of character development. But I think the two things go hand in hand, perhaps through aiming towards self-actualization, you're able to create something great, and it goes the other way. If you aim to create something great or aim towards some big achievement, then you become the person you need to be along the way.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, that's sort of him at the start of the movie. I think that's mostly what I've got to say about that. So basically, go on.
Sorry, is there any like theories on what this narrator like is called? Is there any like kind of Easter eggs in the movie that could suggest what his name is, or is it kind of just left up to the like imagination of the viewer?
I've heard him called Jack before, although I don't really know where that comes from. Maybe it's some sort of Easter egg. But I think ultimately, as the movie goes on, like, his name is Tyler Durden, but he doesn't know that. Which maybe, I mean, we'll get into more about this in terms of Tyler Durden being like a projection of who he truly is. But yeah, I think I guess his actual identity is Tyler Durden, because that's what everyone knows him as. That's the name on his IDs. But because I guess at the start of the movie, the symbolism of it is at the start of the movie, he lacks individual identity, that he doesn't even have a name.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I see from it anyway. But moving on, so basically he develops insomnia, and I think like he talks to a doctor about it, and doctor recommends like, oh, if you want to see some people who are really suffering, then go to like the testicular cancer like support group, like talk group. So he goes there, and he's basically with all these people. Well, he first goes to the testicular cancer one, which the significance of that is, I think the movie's a lot about how his masculinity is repressed,
Yeah.
and in the testicular cancer support group, because these people have had testicular cancer. I'm not sure about exactly what happens, but I think like they lose all their testosterone and shit. So
Yeah.
these are men who have literally been castrated
Feminized in a certain
and
sense.
have lost their
Yeah.
masculinity in the physical sense.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
I remember like when I was researching it, it seemed like Chuck Pal, whatever, I don't know how you say his last name, Pal or something.
yeah,
Like like an early start, I mean, early part of the movie is kind of this concept of like the feminization of America, how like men are kind of being stripped of their masculinity, and obviously that's represented so perfectly in testicular cancer support groups.
yeah.
But
I think we'll get into more talking about the masculinity element of it, I think, when we talk about the transformation. But
yeah,
yeah, so he goes to these support groups, and he ends up crying a lot. He doesn't really say much, but he just like cries and hugs them. And I think this cures his insomnia temporarily. And I think the reason it cures his insomnia is because he lacks human connection and authenticity. So his daily interactions are very trivial and not personal. Um, Whereas these interactions, he's interacting with people and connecting with them on a real human level, even though it's kind of out of their own suffering.
mm.
But he's able to actually be truly vulnerable with people. So I think maybe that sort of emotional release for him, or emotional connection in a way, allows him to um, cure his insomnia. What do you think about that idea?
I'd say, I mean, like, one thing I've always kind of thought for like the last few years is like when you're feeling down or something, like the act of talking to someone about it is so powerful. But one thing that I think stops a lot of people is like a lot of people, in my opinion, don't want to talk to someone about it because they're almost scared of like the reaction they'll get, no matter if that reaction will be good or bad. Like if you express your feelings to a person and they kind of comfort you saying, "Oh, I'm sorry this happened to you," and all that, like the person that's expressing the feelings might not want that sympathy, or they might want that sympathy and they don't get it. So like I feel like with support groups, in terms of like terminal illness support groups or like addiction support groups, when you express your feelings so much, the other people, because they're in that same sort of situation, they know how to react to you, and they'll kind of give you almost a perfect reaction, and that like you have that release of this stress by simply saying it, and then you kind of have that confirmation of the stress being gone when like by the reaction that you get from that person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a feeling that that you're in it together almost.
Yeah, that there's no like
Maybe less
judgment.
judgment there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
yeah,
that's what I'd probably say about that. What about yourself?
yeah. So I'm not entirely sure if that's the whole reason it cures his insomnia. I feel like there might be a bit more there, because I basically go on to this woman Marla, who's like the main woman in the movie. Um, when she starts coming to the support groups, she's also doing the same thing that the narrator is. She doesn't have anything wrong with her, but she's turning up to these support groups. And he sees her at all of these support groups, and it brings back his insomnia. And I think this is because I think it exposes um, that he's not genuine, and he has sort of a resentment towards Marla, because she's like, she acts as a reminder that he's not that he's not being authentic himself, and he's faking it himself. And also, I think there's a role. I'll talk about this more towards the end of the movie, because I think the ending makes a point about this. But something about like the feminine, like a woman is what initially motivates. It makes him realize that he's maybe inadequate in a way, or he's not the person that he wants to be.
Yeah.
And that sort of brings back his insomnia, and it's sort of because it highlights the fact that he lacks his masculinity. His masculinity has been suppressed, which leads to the creation of this hyper-masculine character, which has those traits integrated into their character, because that's because the fact that this Marla woman has come along, he's attracted to her, but he's in denial about it. So that becomes suppressed, but deep down he knows that he's maybe it reminds him that he's not the person he wants to be, and his life isn't the way it wants it to be.
Yeah, I remember like seeing Jordan Peterson talk about it, how like the sex that you're attracted to, they can give like a real true reflection of who you think you are. Because if you don't think you're like almost good enough to go up to that person and try and pursue a relationship with them, or even if like that you don't think it, even if you try and you're not good enough, that is such a good measurement of like the kind of person you are, if that makes sense. Like if you're not worthy of being with this partner because they say so or because you think so, then there is something wrong with you. Not in like a negative sense, but like it gives you the opportunity to figure out what that is and then possibly grow from that. And maybe that's why, like you were saying, Tyler gets that. No, not Tyler. The narrator gets that insomnia.
I think
experience.
Yeah, I think it's more relevant. I think it's more relevant for men, because that's like the ultimate rejection, because like archetypically nature is associated with the feminine. So basically, for you to be rejected is for nature to say that you're not good enough, which it sort of reflects the fact that if you're being rejected as a sexual mate, then you're being told by nature that your genes aren't good enough to be passed on, or you're not good enough to be able to, do what you're maybe been created to do, which is, I guess, to create offspring. So it's like the ultimate rejection in a way. And so yeah, that brings back his insomnia when Marla starts turning up, and this is around the point after this happens where he meets Tyler on a plane, and I think here this is good point to just talk about sort of Tyler, his philosophy, the person he is, his outlook on things, and just get into sort of the way he sees things. So we've kind of alluded to this earlier on, but basically in the repression of these desires that he has, and of his masculine drives that he has as a human, that he's repressed for the situation he's in and for the type of life he lives. Carl Jung has the idea of the shadow, which is basically the parts of you that repress form themselves into this. So you have the persona, which is the you which you show to the world, and the you that you try to project yourself as to other people. Then you have the shadow, which is the parts of yourself that are repressed. So it's like the opposite of the persona. So in this movie, the narrator is a persona, and then Tyler is a shadow. And basically what happens in the movie is the shadow is manifested as a literal character of the parts of the narrator, which deep down he has the drives maybe to fulfill, but but has been repressed. So Tyler is this hyper masculine character. He does what he wants. He says what he wants. He's dominant. He's an individual. He's not conforming to society. So these are the sort of values he has. And a big one of his values is anti-consumerism. He talks about, there's this quote from it, the things you own end up owning you. So
Yeah.
He basically sees the fact that these large corporations try to sell us goods to make us individuals is they're tricking us, and really they're hiding us from our true individualism by consuming. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. He could almost regard Tyler as like an Ubermensch.
Yeah,
how he's setting his own like hierarchy of values and like attaining those on his own accord without the need for consuming to what society tells him to do. But like one thing I haven't really like been able to understand is what's the significance of like Tyler, like his job is selling soap, isn't it? Is there any significance that you can think of with that? Like soap, such a thing, is a thing that cleans the like dirt. I guess you could argue like Tyler maybe has this ideology of cleaning the dirt from the world, like consumerism, by creating like total anarchy, like towards the end of the movie with the whole plot twist. But like, do you think there's any significance to him like selling soap?
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea, thinking of it as cleaning away the dirt. But I also there's in the part of the movie where they go to make soap, they basically go to like a liposuction clinic or whatever, where they have all the fat that they've thrown in the bins, so they make it from human fat. And later on in the movie, a big thing of Tyler's philosophy and the project Mayhem, which is what he aims to execute, is about human sacrifice. And so I think the fact that the soap is made from human tissue maybe alludes to the human sacrifice. But yeah, that's kind of that's one idea about it that comes to mind. But yeah, so this Tyler Durden character, another key element of his philosophy is embracing suffering and death as a part of life. So this goes back to the sort of last man way of viewing the world, or the way of living for the last man, which is to, in the face of death, to try and hide from death through pleasure and comfort, and sort of denying suffering and death as essential parts of life. Always trying to hide from it, always trying to escape it. Whereas Tyler Durden, a big part of his philosophy is embracing the pain. There's a point in the movie where he sprinkles his chemicals on the hand of the narrator, and this gives him a chemical burn on his hand, which is obviously extremely painful, but he forces him to feel the pain. And obviously with the fighting as well, that's embracing pain. But there's definitely something about this philosophy of embracing suffering and embracing pain as parts of life, which enables us to maybe actualize our potential, or I guess, show what we have inside. What are your thoughts on that in terms of embracing suffering as part of life, and his philosophy towards death?
I mean, linking it back to, I think, Nietzsche, he kind of talked about like the last man kind of complex would lead to like nihilism or like hedonism. And like, it seems like Tyler Durden is like a character that almost embodies the opposite of hedonism. It's kind of almost a pursuit of suffering without and avoiding pleasure, rather than pursuing pleasure at all costs and avoiding pain at all costs, as hedonism usually is. So it's kind of like a reaction to, well, I guess it links back to the narrator's like shadow. Like the narrator is a hedonistic consumer who wants to have these simple pleasures in life that give him no meaning, and then deep down this shadow embodies itself as Tyler Durden, and then goes completely opposite to hedonism and wants to like suffer. But I don't know what significance that has in terms of like what does it say about like the modern day America.
I think in terms of suffering, I think when you confront suffering directly, it gives you a sort of freedom that you can't have before. So initially, he has this nicely furnished apartment which gets burned down, and I think it goes on to say that it was Tyler Durden, or I guess the narrator himself actually, who was the one that set off like an explosion in the apartment. But then Tyler basically lives in this abandoned house where there's leaks everywhere. It's extremely uncomfortable, but living in that uncomfortable environment and letting go of all your vices, and living in that discomfort, sort of, it gives you the freedom in that it takes away the things that you thought you needed and you thought you rely on, and maybe it gives you this feeling of self-reliance and like agency over your own being, and maybe that links into being okay with death as well, because you're directly confronting the suffering of life rather than trying to run away from it, which makes you stronger and more free. So I think it's certainly something freeing about confronting suffering head on. Like I noticed this in myself, like when I went through a phase of doing cold showers every day, and you get used to it and you sort of learn to enjoy the pain of it, because the cold, it's so uncomfortable and you still feel that discomfort, but you realize like this is as uncomfortable as it gets. Like this is discomfort, this is it, but you're there and you're actually fine. So you kind of learn that you're maybe stronger than you are, and you're not reliant on the materialistic things that you think you are, which gives you that personal strength and confidence, and also a sense of freedom in yourself.
It kind of almost emphasizes your independence rather than being dependent on these like amenities that the modern world has, like hot showers, warm food, a nice bed. It gives you more independence and strips you back. Well, I guess it just strips you back down to what we used to be like thousands of years ago, or even hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I think this idea of like confronting and embracing suffering is something we see in a lot of the figures that people look up to nowadays. So I mean, if we look back, I think it's part of the Stoic philosophy as well, and Marcus Aurelius is not indulging and embracing discomfort as a voluntary discomfort as a way of becoming more developed. And we see more modern people like David Goggins, who takes it to the extreme in terms of embracing discomfort as what gives you that meaning in life. And the way, like, David Goggins' book is called Can't Hurt Me, so it gives you that like feeling that you're actually indestructible when you don't need to be scared, and that gives you a certain amount of freedom when you are not scared of pain or even death. And another person who kind of represents this to people is Jocko Willink. Like he talks about how he gets up every morning, he gets out of his bed, and obviously you have the urge to stay in the comfort of your bed, but to go out and confront that suffering is what gives you that meaning to life. And like that's something the same as Marcus Aurelius as well. He's got this passage from Meditations where he talks about how he doesn't want to get out of his bed because it's cozy, but he talks about how, like, as his purpose in this world is higher than the comfort and pleasure. He needs to go out and confront the world, and that's the right thing to do. I think that's really what the embracing of death and suffering as an antidote to the consumeristic and comfort seeking philosophy that the narrator has. I think that's Tyler's philosophy, and that's the value of it.
When you kind of reference David Goggins' book called Can't Hurt Me, it's a little bit funny because it's called Can't Hurt Me, but it's only the fact that we can't hurt him is only based on we can't hurt him based on the fact that he hurts himself every day by doing these grueling challenges. It seems like a bit of a paradox initially, but I guess if you become your own worst enemy and conquer that enemy, then no one else can be a bigger enemy to you than yourself.
Yeah, perhaps it's a means of developing strength and independence and freedom, but you need to take it on voluntarily, or else you won't be free, because you'll be a slave to avoiding discomfort. You won't. Yeah. So yeah. And so he talks about this idea of so there's a saying from it, like, I forget what it is. It's like self-improvement is for dummies or something. I can't remember what he says. Like, self-improvement is for dummies. I'm actually going to pull it up because that's just not it. Self-improvement. Oh no, it's self-improvement is masturbation. Self-destruction, on the other hand, which it's an interesting one, because obviously, I mean, I personally, and presumably you do too, believe in self-improvement as like a goal to have. But I think what he talks about in terms of what he's referring to in terms of self-improvement here is creating this superficial image of the external world, which, yeah, I guess is seeking validation from the external world and conforming to the standards that other people put on you. That's a self-destruction, which is self-destruction. Obviously, the movie's very violent and they fight a lot, so they're quite literally like destroying each other. But the self-destruction, I think, also talks about the destruction of those trivial things, those materialistic things, allowing them to be destroyed, the things that aren't truly you. So yeah, that's that idea of self-destruction, maybe.
Yeah, I guess you could say like all the self-improvement that you see nowadays is usually guided by like not exactly a dozen, but like a dozen different books that most of the world is privy to. But if everyone's improving themselves based on these small number of books, they're just conforming to like the social norm. So is that necessarily the Ubermensch way and the higher man way?
Yeah.
Whereas self-destruction releases yourself from all these what would you call it? Releases yourself from all these like trivial, I don't know, like trivial shared experiences that you only adhere to because other people do too.
Yeah, it goes back to this idea maybe of setting yourself free, but I think we'll talk more like I think I've dedicated a whole section to sort of talking about like the pitfalls of Tyler Durden's philosophy of the world. But I think the biggest, most of the pitfalls in it are underlined by this sort of cynicism towards the world. So perhaps you're right in rejecting the consumerism and the control of large corporations over the way you choose to live. But he takes that all the way and maybe degrades things like self-improvement, which are actually good things, or degrades things like taking responsibility, like starting a career or starting a job would be taking responsibility, which I think is a positive thing. But because his character is so cynical about the system, which is maybe a reflection of him being like the shadow of the narrator, who's so conformist to the system, it goes all the way the other way. Whereas there's a balance there. We talk about, like we spoke about in the previous episodes, about how culture has two elements of the wise king and also the tyrant, and perhaps Tyler identifies the culture as purely a tyrant and doesn't see the wise king, the elements of culture and society and establishment that makes our lives better. So perhaps it's a one-sided viewpoint, but there maybe is still some value to take from that self-destruction philosophy.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. We'll definitely get into that later.
Yeah.
Some ideas.
So yeah, I think we saw. I've got another point here about masculinity and individualism, but I think we've kind of spoke about that already. But that's what Tyler sort of encapsulates as non-conformist to culture and sort of hyper masculine traits. So the next section is talking about the transformation of the narrator over the course of the movie, eventually turning into Tyler Durden, becoming the person who's currently his projection. And a massive theme of the movie, obviously it's called Fight Club, is the use of violence and aggression as a means of getting that transformation. So I'll let you go first on that. Like, what do you think about what is the value of aggression and developing your capacity for violence and, you know, doing those things physically?
The value of like violence and aggression, I'd say in recent times, have been like diminished because there's not a necessity for the community that you live in to be protected at all times. Because we've like grown to civilizations, to a civilized age where on average we're so much more peaceful than it used to be. Whereas back in the day, like when we were in smaller tribes and communities, it was necessary to have this strong dependence on violence and aggression for the safety of the community. But like due to the fact that we've come into a more peaceful age, you would assume that the value of violence is gone, and it is gone, but that doesn't mean that the capacity for it has gone with it. Like men, especially compared to women, because of our testosterone levels on average, you still have that urge to be violent and be like have rough play, and it's so necessary for men to do some sort of martial art or some sort of physical sport for their own like physical health and mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And the value of violence has gone down, but the importance of it, maybe on an individual level, maybe the importance of violence and aggression has kind of transferred from a communal level, like community-based level, in terms of safety for the community, and it's like transferred into the individual level, because the individual still has this urge and capacity for it, so it's important to them, but it can't be just like left untapped and like untamed. It needs to be tamed and be controlled for it to be valuable rather than destructive. So that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that is exactly my thoughts on it as well. This is as you said, the need for it in society has gone down, but we've evolved for millions of years with this. It's almost a fundamental biological drive that we have, and I think if you deny that biological drive, we have that drive for aggression, then it will become repressed and it will become part of the shadow, which I think is maybe partly why this movie is so relevant to men in modern times, because like Carl Jung spoke about, the desires which are most commonly are suppressed and part of the shadow are sexual desires and aggression, which I think goes to show the sort of importance of aggression, and in modern culture, as we've surpassed the need for it, and obviously reducing violence is probably a positive thing for society and culturally. It leaves us with a more stable society, and you wouldn't want people going around starting fights all the time. But we pay the price in terms of not meeting that innate internal desire we have for aggression. As you said, particularly for men, due to the higher testosterone levels, this is what maybe the reason why testosterone developed, so that we have this capacity for aggression. And when we deny that, it's not good for the psyche, and probably leads to some unfulfillment. So yeah, I think it's important. And so one of the things you mentioned there actually was finding a way to integrate it in a healthy way through maybe martial arts or sports or different or exercise, but being able to channel that aggression in a healthy way so that it's not repressed, but
Yeah.
that you're also not so it's integrated, but it's also controlled, and it's not doesn't end up being destructive. And yeah, we'll talk about it more in the section kind of about the rise of the project Mayhem and the pitfalls of the philosophy. But I think it's definitely one of them, how the aggression becomes out of control, and like the pleasure from using that aggression goes too far and goes towards complete destruction.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like aggression will always manifest itself somewhere in the psyche and the body, and like it's up for the individual to take responsibility for that and manifest it in a positive way and controlled way, or let it run rampant, and it could manifest itself in like I don't know, like domestic violence or like just bad character.
Yeah,
on like a day-to-day basis, maybe. I don't know.
no, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That if you when things you know, with the shadow, Kyung talks about how these desires, they will in the shadow, these repressed drives will make themselves known, but it will often come in sabotaging your own goals, which maybe the persona is pursuing, or the image you're trying to project towards other people. The shadow will sabotage that, and so yeah, I think if you don't have that integrated, then bad things will happen. And I think yeah, think there's this idea. I'm not really sure where I've heard it, but that weak men are dangerous because those are the ones with these repressed desires, and
Yeah.
if the opportunity comes, they will manifest it. It comes back to this idea we spoke about of morality often being confused with cowardice, because these people are not don't follow the law, for example, because they're a good person and they wouldn't want to hurt someone. It's because they're afraid of the consequences, and they're not strong enough to do it. But when the opportunity does come, they would implement destruction and probably gain a fair amount of joy from it, as
Yeah.
that desire they've been denying manifests itself in destruction.
Yeah, it kind of refers back to what we talked about when it in terms of the documentary Woodstock and that festival.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, well, that movie, it was around the time of Fight Club as well. It's slightly after Fight Club was released, and that's one of the things they mentioned in the documentary, how perhaps like the culture at the time, like Fight Club was a big thing culturally for people on it, and it had a lot of violence in it, but it perhaps reflected a lot of the resentment that people had, especially as
Possibly for
resentment build
themselves,
up.
maybe.
Sorry.
Like maybe like possible resentment for themselves, or how have I let myself become this consumerist like cog in the machine, or cog in the machine, sorry. When you say it was around the same time, was that the book was released at the same time, or
I think the
movie?
movie was out before
Right.
stock. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but yeah, that it's interesting you say that perhaps a resentment towards themselves. I'd maybe say, but most people involved wouldn't have the awareness to maybe think that. I think because obviously resentment towards the establishment the of the festival, and perhaps rightfully so, because there's such poor infrastructure and it had been a big disappointment, and everything was very expensive. They had reasons to be resentful. And when the opportunity came to manifest that resentment through destruction, perhaps those internal drives that aren't met in their daily lives manifest themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it mimics the same idea from Fight Club. but yeah, so another point here is exploration and integration of the shadow. So yeah, that's maybe what the transformation in the movie is about. There's a physical character which manifests his shadow, and as the movie goes on and he takes action, he gradually integrates that shadow, or perhaps even becomes possessed by it as he goes. As the movie kind of does end in destruction. I mean, we'll talk more about the ending, but eventually he is able to, I think, integrate the shadow, and at that point, Tyler is no longer necessary, so he disappears, and yeah, so
yeah, I guess the shadow consumes him and becomes him.
Yeah, but we'll talk. We'll be. I think we'll talk more about this at the end of the movie. But yeah, that's about the transformation. And the one last thing I wanted to talk about was the transformation was consistently throughout the movie. The narrator resists the transformation from Tyler Durden, and I think this is reflective of when you try to make a change in yourself, the previous part of yourself will resist, because I can't remember who it was, but it maybe was Carl Jung who talks about, I think it was one of these like famous psychologists that talk about how like different drives manifest themselves as like personalities. So the personality of your old self does not, it's like a person within itself that does not want to die, so it's going to resist that change, which would lead to it being burned off. But yeah, so I think there's always that tendency for the old self to resist, but also throughout the movie, like we've briefly spoke about, and we'll get more into how it goes too far, and perhaps the old self, like the narrator, it's not just his old self arbitrarily resisting it for the sake of self-preservation. It's also a matter of him seeing the moral injustice that Tyler is implementing.
Yeah.
Well, what's your thoughts on all of
that? I mean, I think you're kind of completely right in referencing that psychologist who says like everyone kind of has personalities, and then when you kind of develop through life, it's almost like one personality is becoming smaller and disintegrating while a new personality is taking form. And you could kind of even say, like, is that possibly why teenage years are so difficult for a lot of kids? Because like you're going through puberty, your body is physically changing, or like your hormones are changing, so that changes your mindset, and you do develop into this new person, and that can be quite a scary thing for like a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's easy to want to resist and stay in the form that you are, but it is also necessary to develop with the world and develop with like the way your life is going. But like, there is definitely, I guess you could say there's some value in resisting the change, but that value only holds that resistance only holds value as long as the change that happens holds on to the good parts of your old personality. Like if you're kind of scared of this transformation, that's a good thing, because it means you're scared of losing these positive attributes that you think you have, and then that can lead to you making sure that you hold on to those and bring those into the new form.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's like I guess it's a value judgment at a certain point, but it's so hard to judge it in an objective way where you think, oh, actually, yeah, this is a part of myself which I need to let go, because like seeing these drives, thinking of them as a person who wants to obviously aims to preserve themselves, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between a good reason for you continue to having these traits versus just a rationalization for the sake of comfort in staying in your old self rather than transforming. So I guess people need to I guess you need to learn to judge for yourself, like how you need to change and what parts of yourself you need to allow to be destroyed and killed and burned off in the process of transformation. And perhaps in this movie, like, the narrator realizes that he's extremely dissatisfied with his life. He lives a very meaningless life, and for that reason it indicates there's something wrong with his current character, which is why he needs to transform. So that external like the external messaging from the world is that, yeah, my current character isn't what needs to be. The way I currently live my life is wrong. So that perhaps is a way of judging whether it's worth burning off that part of yourself.
I mean, would you say that that judgment should have an external input from, like, for example, friends and family, or like you could argue, like, in this movie, the narrator kind of judges that solely by himself, whereas if he had like a community around him that he could come to and ask for advice, would that help him make a better value judgment of what to keep in the transformation and what to burn away? Like, well, I guess ultimately it probably does come down to an individual choice, but in my eyes, you could argue, like, there is a necessity for an external input because, like you were saying, they don't have the same bias that you do.
Yeah, the feedback from the world is definitely important. Obviously, having people there to say that, but a part of me does lean towards the importance of it being an individual decision to be, like we spoke about a lot with the High Man. It's about not conforming and considering values for yourself, and in some sense that does need to be an individual decision. No one can make that for you. It's your own moral battle. It's your own war that you have to fight yourself. And yeah, you need to confront the contradictions and the arguments along the way for each side, but ultimately it is your own decision. But there certainly is value in examining how the external world is responding to you.
Yeah, I think there's a true value in, like, consulting someone else, not necessarily allowing them to make the decision for you, like you're saying. Like, I agree on that bit, but I do hold, like, in my eyes, there is, like, such a importance of having someone else almost analyze your life and, like, not tell you what's wrong with it or what's good about it, but just having a different perspective on who you are informs yourself more so you can make a better decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that kind of brings us into the rise of Project Mayhem. So the thing I noticed about this, we spoke about how the narrator is obviously dissatisfied with this consumeristic philosophy and the conformist way that he currently lives his lives as another cog in the wheel of this materialistic and consumeristic society where he doesn't really feel any real meaning. But I think, but in the face of that, as the movie develops, Project Mayhem starts, which is basically Tyler Durden's almost, you could call it like a terrorist group that he eventually forms. And this group, it kind of follows some of Tyler's philosophies of embracing death and suffering and things like that, but at the same time it completely strips the individualism of each of the members, which I think it goes to show that in rejecting one ideology is very easy to fall into another. And I was thinking about this in terms of kind of the things I see, particularly online, and maybe the things I've even at points fallen prey to myself is when you realize that one school of thought is wrong, it's easy to fall into maybe the opposite school of thought and believe that it's right. But ultimately you're making the same mistake of conforming to a new ideology. So an example I see is like the conformist thing that I think maybe broader society puts forward, or maybe not broader society, maybe it's like a loud minority on the internet, but it's a very sort of woke culture. That sort of thing, very left-wing progressive. You can't say this, you can't say that, you need to conform to our ideas. but you see a lot of people online, as they see that this is wrong, they maybe go too far the other way and go to this extreme. Like, don't know if you've come across like a lot of the red pill people online, or like Andrew Tate and all these like fresh
Yeah,
type of people. So they see what's wrong with the way that they're told to view the world by this one group of people, but in doing so they fall into the ideology of a different group, which is perhaps just as pathological. So so I think that's a key part of the movie, how these people, in abandoning the previous ideology, that they go into another one, which ultimately also strips their individualism.
Yeah. I mean, does that kind of show the necessity for humans to be part of a community, or is it possible to have a community built from purely individual people? Like, do humans have to always conform to some sort of ideology to form a community? Or can we have individual people having very different like values and hierarchy of like priorities, still live peacefully together and like share some values?
Yeah, well, I mean, it takes us kind of into it goes into the end of the movie, how I think that how like the narrator gets taken away from how the way he was initially living life, but when he eventually falls into this this other extreme ideology, he eventually has to sacrifice that, and at that point, that's when he becomes the individual. That's when Tyler dies, and so I think it is possible to navigate these different ideologies without falling prey to becoming just simply a conformist member of the group. But there is certainly the temptation there, and in abandoning one ideology, it's very easy and alluring to like fall into another one. But I think as an individual, like, yeah, that's sort of what you need to do. That's your responsibility to navigate those things. But you mentioned about like communities as well, and obviously communities are a very important thing in people's lives. But and I guess finding people who's like your friends and stuff, your values should align with them. But I think that's different from this sort of extreme ideology. You're still an individual, so you maintain your individualism while still being a member of the community.
Yeah, I guess, I guess communities can be built on like from a multitude. Communities can be built from like a plethora of people that have different religions or like different like goals in life, and they can still share maybe some foundational values that allow the community to like strive forward.
Yeah, I think a community of individuals is stronger than a community of like cogs in the machine. Ultimately, that forms a better society than simply a community of people possessed by the same ideology.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So one thing, I haven't actually looked into this, but it made me think about this, and it was something you mentioned, I think, in the Nietzsche podcast, and it was the idea of creative destruction. So do you want to
power?
Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember it. I think like Nietzsche had this idea that there's such thing called the will to power, and the will to power is kind of what allows things to progress and like transform and like transcend into these new and advanced, I guess you call it, beings or like modes of society or whatever. But the will to power is only like viable when something uses its power to create something new. But in that creation or something new, something has to be destroyed. I can't remember exactly it now, but yeah, something along the lines of that. There's in the creation of something, there is also destruction.
Yeah.
You might have given like a literal example, but I can't remember it exactly.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this because I haven't looked into it a lot, but it seemed like an idea. Like we spoke about kind of the pitfalls of what I see in Tyler Durden's philosophy, but this one to me, it wasn't quite as clear cut, because basically the goal of Project Mayhem was to basically destroy the credit card buildings and wipe out all credit card debt and basically reset society.
Mm.
And like I don't know whether, like, I've been debating philosophically whether this destruction of society is actually like a reasonable ultimate goal to take to the end.
Yeah.
Uh,
Is the
or
sacrifice
whether
worth
it's,
the end?
yeah, like is he just in this destruction because he knows that the destruction is a means of building the new society which he believes to be greater? Or going back to, I mentioned how like one of my criticisms of the philosophy of Tyler Durden is the general cynicism of culture, and whether this is just a manifestation of cynicism. Perhaps like we spoke about Cain and Abel a fair amount, right? Perhaps this is the act of Cain not liking society and sort of throwing his toys out the pram, so to speak, and deciding, you know what, if I'm not winning this game, then it should be destroyed.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I don't know if it's just. I get the inkling that it's not, but I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there about the element of creative destruction.
Yeah, I guess Nietzsche maybe alludes to the fact that for society to advance, like what he likes, Nietzsche was obviously believes there's a hierarchy of power and like status almost. And for a society to advance, people need to come together and they need to build things together. But that kind of like formed in a hierarchical society means that someone at the top will have power over those at the bottom, and the sacrifice and the creative destruction maybe alludes to the fact that these individuals that do the work at the bottom, they're destroyed, but creatively destroyed, let's say, by like having their freedoms taken away because they need to go work for X amount of money. And like the will to power of the person at the top makes sure that this happens, even though he destroys the individuals at the bottom in like a certain sense. So maybe that's what like Nietzsche is kind of referring to, and then he thinks that's a good thing for the betterment of society, even though there's sacrifices made by people lower down in the hierarchy, and maybe that kind of is like what Tyler Durden was trying to do. But then I guess the question it comes to in my mind is the sacrifice of the means worthwhile for the end goal? But like that question can't really be answered, because even if the buildings were blown up, well, if the buildings were blown up and then the credit card debt was wiped out, there's no way of predicting how society would reshape itself and reform. Like you could have this utopian idea of how people would start level again and the playing field would be completely equal, but then like there's no way of guaranteeing that could happen. So how could you guarantee that the sacrifices in the Project Mayhem are worthwhile?
Yeah, I think it goes back to this idea of being cynical about the system, but just because you're cynical about it doesn't necessarily mean you have a better alternative. So
Yeah,
perhaps that destruction and obviously it's a movie, and that destruction is like a physical thing, but in people's lives it might manifest more as simply just cynicism or criticism of the system. And whether that is the correct path forward, my intuition is that is not, because it's not a productive way of viewing things. And perhaps Tyler Durden does have this vision of the world of that he can create from the destruction, and that destruction has to take place first. But it seems to me as if he's adopted an ideology, and it's not necessarily true, and it's kind of an ideology that rejects the value of culture and simply sees it as something to be destroyed. which is obviously a one-sided argument, and I think ideology is built upon an incomplete picture of the world that won't generate good outcomes.
Yeah, they're not informed on the whole image of what's going on, so they can't make the right decision.
Yeah. Yeah, so that kind of brings us into the end of the movie. So this project Mayhem escalates, and the old self is resisting, trying to stop it. Like there's vans with bombs in it, and he's trying to stop, and he's trying to defeat Tyler, but he ends up getting the shit beaten out of him, and he kind of and he hits rock bottom, which is kind of in the movie he's beat up, and then he's flung down this long flight of stairs, and then he hits the bottom, and I think, I'm not sure, I think it was Nietzsche who talks about how you need to hit rock bottom before you can fully transform, and this is when at the end of the movie he says something like, what does the narrator say? He says, so basically they're in a room and Tyler Durden has a gun, and as the narrator knows, oh, he is actually Tyler Durden, he's like, the gun is actually in my hands, and then he's like, oh well, it doesn't make a difference. And then he goes to Tyler like, my eyes are now open, and then he gets a gun and he shoots himself in the mouth. And I think the significance of that is that so he says his eyes are open, so he's undergone the transformation, he realizes it, and he accepts that the transformation may lead to his annihilation in terms of him shooting himself in the face. He realizes that he accepts his own mortality, and he accepts that in transforming it may kill him, and at that point he shoots himself in the face, but he survives, and Tyler dies, because at that point, I mean, some people argue practically like, oh, if he shot himself and he doesn't die, then Tyler shouldn't die. But I think symbolically it means that his transformation is complete, so Tyler is no longer necessary. He's integrated. Yeah. He's actually integrated that character, right, after the transformation.
Yeah, he's like opened his eyes to the shadow and realized what it is, and accepted that is part of him, and because of that acceptance he's able to move on from there and almost, like, what's the word, like, not destroy that part of himself, but
he integrates it,
get it under control.
He integrates it into his character, and at that point the shadow no longer exists, because the shadow is implemented into him, and he's implemented his masculinity, which brings us to the end of the movie, as the buildings are falling down, because they've just been exploded. They're at the top of the skyscraper, and they look out, and then Marla's there, and he and then at that point he like takes Marla's hand, and like the final scene is the buildings falling down, with them holding hands. And I think this is like, it's an interesting role, that like Marla's role in the movie, like at the end of it, it's once he's integrated his masculinity, he, at that point, he can engage in a relationship with a woman. But it was that woman in the beginning of the movie which initially made him realize that he needed to transform, and then after his transformation has taken place, then he can enter into a relationship with this woman once he's become the person. Maybe she realized his insomnia developed while Tyler Durden was created after he met Marla, so perhaps he can become the person that Marla made him realize that he could be, and once he's become that person, then he can go into a relationship with her. Yeah, and so it ties together the whole thing nicely. And with Marla, I think about like the story of Adam and Eve, how in the beginning, how when Adam and Eve become conscious from eating the fruit from the tree of life. From eating the apple, it's Eve that gives Adam the apple and makes him self-conscious and makes him aware. And then with that awareness, I guess as time goes on, he integrates his masculinity that he realized he was missing because of her. And then once that's happened, then it's happily ever after, I guess.
Yeah,
maybe not, but
and you have Cain and Abel, who have, one of them's a dickhead and one of them's a saint at least. But
it's interesting. Have you got any thoughts on like the role of the feminine in the movie? Because obviously it's a movie about masculine transformation, but obviously the feminine plays a large role in that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really have any sort of life without a feminine side and a masculine side, like the yin and the yang. I remember watching like a little video that you sent, and it kind of tells what's the word for it? Like, kind of dissects the movie and different plots and stuff, and like talks about like the feminization of America and how like that kind of creates all these men that feel incomplete, maybe, or like demasculated, if that's the word. And like you could like people might take that in the wrong way, like, oh, feminism has gone too far and all this and that. But I don't think feminism has gone too far. I think the one thing that you could argue that this movie definitely agrees with is that emasculation, masculinity is important, and like the acts of trying to like destroy masculinity by like labeling it toxic or trying to make like femininity more superior than it is a dangerous game. And you could argue like towards the end of the movie, them coming together and starting those relationships maybe like symbolizes the equality between femininity and masculinity.
Yeah,
that one is necessary.
Yin and yang bond.
Yeah, one is necessary to have the other.
Yeah,
and they're just as important. Maybe they share certain like similarities, but like they do differ in like the way they express themselves. But they are important.
Yeah, and they go together. And I just thought it's really really interesting how at the start, like, she was the one that onset the transformation, and then
I guess
at the end
then
it all comes together very nicely at the end, and I think it's a great ending to the movie.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Like the sexual partner that you're trying to attract is the greatest judgment of your character, and that kind of gives you that anxiety and creates this type of Durden. But then overcoming that allows you to be the person that is fit enough and like capable enough of starting a relationship with that person, which obviously, like you said, ties the movie and beautifully to an end.
Yeah, and I think perhaps that ties the podcast nicely to an end as well. That's kind of all I have to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've not watched it in a long time. I sort of want to watch it again now. But
maybe go back and watch it now.
I'll probably dissect it.
And think about these things, because I think great movies and stuff, they do kind of have these philosophical ideas. That's why they resonate with us. So it's interesting to think about movies.
One thing that just amazes me, like, was the author Chuck, like, while he was like writing this out and creating a story, was he really trying to embody these like ideas that we're talking about in this story, or is it kind of like a by chance that he created this story because he thought it would be interesting and like entertaining, and then someone else has kind of externally come in and said, oh, this is why he thought this? Like, did he create this idea of like the masculinity in America and consumerism, or did that masculinity and consumerism inform his book, if that makes sense? Like, which way around was it, do you think?
I think I don't think he consciously knew. I get and this is something that amazes me about great works of like movies and books and things like that. I don't think the people who are writing them, they're not doing it like the act of writing it and the act of producing the art is them exploring the ideas, and the exploration is in the narrative. I don't think like the way like all the ideas today are things we've discussed explicitly, but I think in the writing of movies, like highly creative people are able to create that, like irrespective of, they don't need the explicit explanations of the narrative, because the narrative is the exploration of the philosophy, which I just find I find crazy how I just find it incredible that people can do that. Yeah, I just find it amazing how I don't think when people make these works of art that they have an explicit idea of what it is. Like they're exploring it in the narrative. It's one thing I think Jordan Peterson talked about, like the difference between it was in his book Beyond Order, I think. He talks about how the difference between true art versus like propaganda is that propaganda, the ideas are consciously come up with, and then you try to produce a piece of art that represents the ideas you've come up with. So it's kind of ideological in its basis, whereas what a true art is, like the creation of the art itself is the exploration of the ideas, the
motivations kind of different.
Sorry,
the motivation to create that art is like kind of completely different. Like propaganda motivated, people that make it are motivated to enforce their ideology on someone else, whereas like an artist who encapsulates like what it's like to live in like Nazi Germany, they're motivated just to find this form of expression that like truly identifies with what it's like to live in that world.
I want to say the ideas, but I don't think that's the right word, but I can't think of a better way of putting it. Like the ideas are expressed directly through the art, and the art comes before the explicit discussion of like the symbolism. You don't, like the way an art piece is produced is not by conceptualizing the ideas you want to come across and then sculpting a piece of artwork to come up with those ideas. The artwork is what is fundamental, and then the explicit thing is like it's just like a commentary on that.
Yeah, it's almost like a byproduct, but it's also so up for interpretation. Like you can't say like just an example, like silly example, that a Van Gogh piece of art represents like the suffering of the lower class, whereas he might have just been drawing something, and like someone else could interpret that as the community that the lower class had compared to the higher class, if you know what I mean. And that's sort of one thing I kind of like not disagree with, but like contend Jordan Peterson with. Like in his first book, he references the Bible a lot, like the Cain and Abel story, and all these different biblical like what's the word, like fables, and like the story that he dissects and the way he formulates these like morals that a person should follow from these stories, like it amazes me. But like I asked the question, did the Bible get created to inform people on how to make these morals, or like you were saying then, were these stories just created for the, not the fun of it, but kind of just for the expression of what was happening, and there was no like intention for moral philosophies to be taken from them?
I think that art is the expression of the values, and then from there you can explicitly interpret the values, but the way we understand the world isn't through rationalizing ideas, it's through like subjective narratives. So it's like an intuitive thing rather than it being an explicit conscious thing. Because I think the example of the Bible, like the stories in the Bible, I think are probably so profound because they were distilled over generations into the most fundamental like archetypal elements of the story, which are true to the values of the narrative, which maybe hold something true and fundamental to human experience. And I think a piece of artwork, and tying it back to Fight Club, I think maybe writers do have an understanding of their ideas that they're putting across, but it's more of an exploration of them rather than a conscious trying
Indoctrinate.
to represent the idea through the story. They're exploring the idea with the story.
Okay.
That's kind of how I believe it to work, because I think if you create it purely consciously, like I don't think it's a true piece of art in a way.
Right. That makes sense.
It's a topic.
Yeah, that was a great episode. I really enjoyed that one, to be fair.
Yeah, no, it's definitely good.
Leave in the comments what movie you want us to do next.
Yeah, we can discuss some ideas after the episode.
Yeah.
Should hopefully be doing like one a week now, I think.
Yeah, we both started uni and we should be able to get a nice routine in.
And got good things coming. But I was hoping to get some more clips out.
Find a day that works best for us, or maybe like find 2 days that works best.
Yeah, and we'll figure out, try and get one done a week, and hopefully putting more clips out on the YouTube channel. And also we can discuss this probably, but it'd be good if we got the podcast on Spotify. Something we should try and do a bit easier to listen to. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you for listening. It's ending the episode at 5:30 p.m. obviously on Thursday the 6th. So cheers for listening, guys. Hope you enjoyed it just as much as we did.
Wonderful.
See you next time.
See ya.
Bye.